Hello everyone, can you hear me okay? Good, great. Good to see you all and thanks very much for coming. My name's Tom McMillan, I'm a professor at the Royal Agricultural University and I'm going to talk to you about the future of meat. And they say the future's already here, just unevenly distributed, and in my work I've been really lucky to meet some of those different bits of the future in the present, so working with scientists who work on the cultured meat side of things, growing lab meat, and also with some of the most innovative farmers. And what will the future be like? Will it be like this kind of thing, so big on the trees and meat as a kind of byproduct of conservation? Will it be more like this? So really ratcheting up the efficiency of meat production, like this multi-story pig farm in China? Will it be lab meat, lab-grown meat, Silicon Valley to the rescue kind of future? Or something like this, where there's no meat to be seen anywhere, not a bit of meat in sight, and we're all eating much more by way of vegetables. And those were some of the contrasting scenarios that a piece of work from Oxford came up with a few years ago, where they looked at two different dimensions of uncertainty. So one was how far we, due to the pressures on meat that I'll come to in a minute, how far we start to kind of moderate that, or how far we stick to our meat eating. And then when it comes to where we change things, the other dimension across was how far the changes we make are most radical when it comes to the technologies we use, or most radical when it comes to the ways we change our behaviour. And we're getting ahead of ourselves though, so let's think for a minute about, let's rewind and think about what about meat now? And when I say what about meat now, some of you probably go, well, yum, I love meat, and some of you probably go, ooh, not so sure about that. But that's not what I meant. I meant, why are we having a conversation about meat now? Why are we even thinking about the future of meat? And one reason is that we just farm so many animals. So the animals we farm weigh 22 times as much as the wild vertebrates in the world when you combine them. And also, we are having this conversation because the way we produce our food accounts for a very big chunk of our overall environmental footprint. And that applies whether you're talking about greenhouse gases here, or our land footprint, or globally our water footprint, and various other bits as well. So it's a big driver in particular of climate change, but lots of other environmental impacts. And changes in land use, mostly for farming, are one of the main causes of a crisis in biodiversity, both globally but also closer to home. And when you look at it globally, it's production of meat mainly that's driving the land use changes that are leading to these big environmental consequences, including the loss of tropical forests. And that includes both the direct effect of farming beef, for example, but also growing the crops to feed animals around the world, like soya. And so we're talking a bit about meat now, not so much because of the health debates, although that's a bit of the picture, or the debates about antibiotic use, which are also important, but mainly because of this direct environmental impact. And of course, not all meat is equal. So when it comes to greenhouse gases, foods from animals generally have a bigger impact than food from plants, with fish and eggs and chicken near the bottom of the heap, if you like, and beef and lamb near the top. But what this also shows is the huge range of production impact you get from different ways of growing, different ways of farming animals. So the best, from a carbon point of view, the most efficient beef in the world is kind of better than the world's worst tofu in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's where it starts to get a bit messy. So, that's the global picture. What's it like in Britain? Things are better here, right? Are they? And animals eat lots of grass, and we grow loads of grass, so surely things are better than that global picture. Well, it's true about the grass, sure, but also it's true that a lot of our meat is imported. So in the orange there, you can see our meat imports. And there's another debate. So not only where does the meat come from, but also how much carbon can we lock up in the soil if we farm the animals that graze differently. So can we farm them in ways that they actually end up locking up more carbon than the equivalent of what they emit through their methane emissions? And the weight of evidence suggests probably not, but it's certainly a really important part of the jigsaw, part of the debate that we need to be taking really seriously. And there's another big debate in the science about methane emissions and how you account for those and how you treat them differently relative to carbon. So methane is a really powerful greenhouse gas, but it stays in the atmosphere less long. It's quite short-lived in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. And so this is a bit of a complicated one, but you can see on the left-hand side here, if you hold methane, CH4, at steady levels, then it's equivalent to temperatures remaining steady. If you hold CO2 at steady levels, emissions at steady levels, then your temperatures go up. So we're used to thinking of constant emissions leading to global warming, whereas for methane it's a bit different. But rather than letting livestock farmers off the hook, what that also means is, on the flip side, if you start to reduce your numbers of animals, ruminant animals, livestock like cattle and sheep, then maybe you've got an opportunity to cool temperatures as well. So it's all pretty confusing. It seems pretty clear the future involves us eating less meat, but is it beef or chicken we should be eating if we're eating meat at all? Should it be British or imported? And what else should we eat instead? And here I'd like to share a few points that have really surprised me when I've been looking into it. So the first surprise is, when it comes to beef, at any rate, and greenhouse gases, British beef has a bigger impact than American beef, US beef, which we tend to think of as kind of the bad guys. And that's not because we don't farm as well here, far from it. It's because our cattle are out there eating more grass, with higher welfare, living longer lives. But it's the short-lived kind of intensive farming in America actually leads, from a carbon-only point of view, to a lower environmental footprint. And one of the implications is it's not just about carbon, is it? It's about other things like nature and animal welfare and so on. Other things matter too. Another surprise, and probably the biggest surprise, is that when it comes to that climate change story, is less about the direct impact of the methane that the cows are giving off through their burps when they're eating and so on, or the soil carbon debate that I mentioned, and more about what you call the carbon opportunity cost. So farming these animals takes a lot of land. How much carbon would you be able to lock up? Not only if you farmed it better, but if you didn't farm it at all, if you did something else with it, like let trees grow or whatever. And so you've got this big yellow bit on that chart, which is what you call the carbon opportunity costs. The cost of farming it for anything, but particularly for livestock, versus doing something else with the land altogether. And that really changes the picture. And it leads you to a really surprising place, which is, up to a point, the less meat we eat, the more room we have for animals to be roaming about the countryside doing the kind of things you associate with farming animals, like grazing, rather than being in sheds. And if we keep on eating meat like we do, at the rates we do, then we end up in a scenario where we have to use more of our land for quite intensive farming of feed, of grain to feed animals, more pigs and poultry, possibly more indoor beef or feedlot beef as well, more intensive farming, and also more crops to do bioenergy and carbon capture as well. So the less meat we eat, the more you end up with a future that looks perhaps a little bit more like what we imagine livestock farming to involve, which is more animals about the place on the land and the kind of future we imagine. So it's an odd counterintuitive conclusion. And pretty much every plausible path, when you look at all the different bits of modelling and scenarios and so on, that leads to us meeting our climate change and our nature and also our animal welfare commitments in the UK, involves us eating less meat, and a fair bit less meat over the next 10 years or so. And the big question is how? How do we do that? How do you end up doing that? And something we looked at, that was something we looked at in this big review called the National Food Strategy that I was involved in, that came out last year, and we recommended a mix of what you call nudges, so like subtle things that make a difference to how we behave, we don't really care or notice them, technological improvements, and also the right mix of support for farmers. And the backdrop to it is the fact that the ways we eat and the ways we farm have changed loads anyway. They change all the time. They've changed loads over the last 60 years. You can see we eat 4 times more chicken than we did 60 years ago, and less beef and lamb. So our diets are changing, including around meat. One of the big switches has been this shift from eating bits of meat to eating meat in stuff, in processed foods and ready meals and so on. And that actually opens up quite a lot of scope for us still eating a bit of meat, but eating other stuff with it, reducing the amount of meat in recipes, in ready meals and so on, and substituting for other things, less impactful ingredients, while also keeping the bits of meat that people who meat might enjoy, as a Sunday roast or whatever. So there's quite a lot of opportunity in there. One of the hitches, though, is that the alternatives that are available for meat at the moment, whether they're plant-based or fermented, like corn, they generally cost more than the meat, which is sort of weird. And so there's some price comparison. The mince and the sausages, chicken, all cost more in the shops than the equivalent meat-free product, apart from for the steaks. Now that would change if we paid the true environmental cost of all these different foods. And you can see there in the green, there's been a kind of notional carbon bill attached to those different products, and it pushes some of them, not all of them, but the mince and the chicken up above the alternative products. The question is, how do you do that? How do you go about getting that environmental cost into the mix so you pay it at the shop rather than kind of in subtle ways through our water bills and farm payments or whatever it might be? And the obvious way would be to tax carbon. However, that turns out to be really unfair. So if you look here, the poorest households end up paying twice as much as the richest for a carbon tax. So that's not a good idea from that point of view. And when you look at whether you might directly or indirectly tax meat, then especially fresh meat, that's so unpopular it'll probably bring people out on the street, like the Gilets Jaunes protests in France around fuel taxes. So it's politically a kind of no-go area, at least for the foreseeable future. So what you're left with is the thing at the top there, which is doing things like setting targets for supermarkets, for fast food restaurants, and broadly, in the long run, it will probably be cheaper for them and more profitable for them to be selling plant-based and other substitutes for meat in place of some of the meat. So probably the commercial incentives are pointing in the right direction for them to kind of run at those targets and enjoy them rather than kind of secretly fight against them, which is what often happens with government setting targets for supermarkets. Government can also do some stuff directly, so tweaking, kind of tuning down the amount of meat that goes into things like school meals, hospital food, other places where it buys and sells food, serves food directly. We also recommended investing in innovation for public money, in innovation to make some of the alternatives to meat better, both tastier, healthier, more affordable, deal with some of those challenges we saw around the cost of them. And there's the innovation you can do in the technologies for farmers. So there's research showing that if cows eat certain seaweeds, they produce less methane, and that's helpful. Some work by my colleagues at the Royal Agricultural University shows us some hiccups with that, so it can be not that great for the cows, and also you've got to grow a ton of seaweed that we don't have at the minute, so it's not easy, but it's got some possibilities. And then finally, we need the right mix of incentives for farmers to make it worth their while to manage the land differently, so to move to that kind of landscape that we might imagine which is environmentally better, but also which has that still has grazing in its place in a way within there. And you might have heard interesting uproar in the past few weeks when government sounded like it might scrap the plans it had been laying for several years about how to get that mix right of incentives for farmers. And it brought the new Environment Minister here out on Twitter to deny the rumour, which, when I was reading the Twitter comments, kind of the main gist was, now I'm even more scared. So I don't know if that worked. But anyway, those are some of the forces at play behind those four really radically different scenarios for the future of meat. From the kind of Blade Runner version where there's kind of intensive farming and lab meat and so on, through to the more bucolic and down in the bottom left-hand corner there. And the question is, which will it be? And I'd be interested, if we've got time, to hear what you all think, or whether there's something not on that map at all. But my money is on it being even more of a mix of all those things. So all of them in different places and different times, but more. And the big challenge for all of us, and particularly for people like the government minister I showed a moment ago, is to make sure it's the best bits of those different possibilities that all get kind of mixed up together rather than the worst bits. But we'll see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. What a fascinating debate. And what I love about this so much is just it feeds into the biggest debate of all, in effect, the amount we want government to intervene in society in order to drive what are regarded as good outcomes, and the sort of social contract, the permission that society grants the government of the day to do that. So just so much to unpack there. I'm sure there's loads of questions. Who wants to go first and ask Tom something about the future of meat? Well, can we just delve a little bit more then into perhaps the ethics of different types of livestock against each other? Because one of the things you brought out there was the carbon footprint, say, perhaps of chicken, it being lower than red meat. But yet, when we think about the ethics of how those animals are farmed, it's the indoor production and other things that many consumers are finding more challenging now versus that image of a cow or a sheep in pasture. But when those two things conflict in terms of different things that consumers want, how do we sort of negotiate our way through that to arrive at something which is maybe the median good, perhaps?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, like with all these debates, there's loads of different kind of angles through it in a way. So even when you're talking about the ethics, there's obviously a completely plausible ethical view, which is it's unethical to eat any of it, and that starts from certain starting points. But if you're not of that view, and you're interested in the ethics of animal welfare in a way, then which is just one bit of the ethical debate, because there's all the ethics of slaughter and so on, then you tend to get kind of two lines of argument. So one focuses on the sort of physical well-being of the animals. So, and you can start to measure that in quite detailed ways. So you can look at the animals, basically their health, and things which are not necessarily crucial to their survival but are known to cause pain and suffering, and you can measure in different farming systems how well they do on those different dimensions. And some of the best sort of indoor intensive farming systems can score quite high on those sort of measurable things that hurt kind of scores, basically, or indeed how many animals are inadvertently dying when they shouldn't be, and all sorts of things like that. Where they score less well is on the bit that is pretty hard to count and pretty hard to measure, but which intuitively a lot of us would feel is pretty central to animal welfare, and that's about kind of are the animals happy. So it's not just about are they not in pain, but it's about are they do they have positive welfare, so are they actually happy? And the shorthand for that is, does it matter if they've got the sun if they can feel the sun on their backs or not? And that's one of the big debates in animal welfare. It's one of those things where there's not a right answer, and my view is it matters massively. If you can not on a routine farm, but you can scientifically kind of do research which explores how happy or not animals are in different situations. So you can get a feel for where animals are thriving and where they're not. And those tend to be environments which are kind of, I guess, more natural, as you might imagine it. But it's not a cut and dried thing. And it often comes down to where you're starting the debate, not so much what the science shows. Often that's about running down tracks that are set by our assumptions about what matters or our beliefs about what matters. And the same applies to animal welfare.
In his book Regenesis, George Monbiot comes to a very interesting conclusion. He says that actually something like organic beef is probably the worst in terms for the environment, whereas we think of that as perhaps one of the best then.
Well, it all depends how much you're eating of it, really, and that's the crucial thing. That's why, and what we value and what we want. And if you're kind of wanting to absolutely max out on how much greenhouse gases we can save from the food system, how much space we can make for nature in its kind of more wild forms, then you'd go down a route which absolutely minimises all meat consumption, except for where you're actively wanting livestock to be helping manage particular kinds of habitat that rely on those animals being there. And the more you focus on climate change, the more you'd want to reduce your grazing and reduce your meat consumption. But if you're going, well, the food system's only got to do a certain amount solve a certain amount of the climate change problem. There's other bits of it too, and we like a diverse landscape, and we like more of those habitats that depend on animals. Then it kind of shifts the balance a little bit. And so again, it's sort of a lot of the answer depends on what the context is, what your sort of premise is, what you're trying to do, and not just on the science of how much the impact is of a particular product. So there's plenty of room, as I've showed in those slides with the sort of stripes across the UK. There's plenty of room for extensive kind of agroecological grazing systems like organic in a future where we are substantial but a still fairly plausible amount less meat.
There's been an awful lot of talking since the National Food Strategy was published, but the political willpower to perhaps take action on many of the recommendations doesn't seem to be there at the moment. Mm-hmm. Is there any countries that you studied that are taking more active steps to perhaps shape meat consumption or to impose the true cost of it at a consumer level?
Mm-hmm. So on meat, and in fact on a lot of things, including some of the health evidence we looked at, mostly it's cities and small countries that tend to be doing the most interesting and innovative things. So for example, in Denmark and Copenhagen in particular, you're seeing some really impressive moves in terms of transforming the food they serve in public institutions, but on like a really bold scale. We did a review looking mainly at the health side, at where governments across the world had tried to make quite big interventions in influencing how we eat at a kind of population level, and actually it was quite surprising. It wasn't a very long list of places that were doing amazing things, but there were these sort of relatively well-known examples, particularly of cities where and particularly focused around public procurement, so food institutions, where you were saying quite big, quite bold moves, and much bolder than we've seen here. But on the environmental kind of farming policy side, and as you know, kind of as much as anybody, these new policies the government has been trying to bring in to change how farms are paid for managing the land environmentally haven't been easy. They've been quite hard to design right and quite tricky, but broadly they've been heading in the right direction, and they've probably been a bit ahead of the game in terms of many other countries in making that shift from the ways that farmers get paid by using taxpayers' money now to one where there's much more kind of, I guess, environmental benefit back to us as a public for the money that we're putting in.
Yes, certainly.
Hi, sorry I came about halfway, so if you touched on this, I apologise. But I'm just interested in how you see the interplay between sort of how we're going to trend our meat consumption down more generally, and the interplay between then, like, the access to like textiles and fibres and stuff that obviously we want to move away from petrochemicals. Mm-hmm. So like the access to like wool and leather and things. I just wondered if you have any comment on that, because it's just quite an interesting tension, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it is really interesting. I think we're quite a long way off where that tension bites in a way. So when you look at wool, you know, the big sheep meat consumption and production have been declining in the UK for quite a long time. Yet we still have problems getting rid of wool and using it in a way which kind of in any way attributes serious value to it. And we've got quite a lot of headroom before we run into that tension. So I completely agree. It's a really difficult thing. But I guess there's similar scope for plant-based kind of fibres and things as well, which are similarly neglected. So things like flax and hemp and so on there's always lots of interest in kind of getting those going. But at the same time, there is, and some of my colleagues at the RAU work on wool rope, which is coming up with new ways to make textiles that will get used at a significant scale out of wool, because nobody's using it enough. So yeah, and you're right, it's a tension, but I think it's a long way till that kicks in relative to some of these other tensions that we're already grappling with now.
I just wanted to ask, how much of an issue do you think antibiotic use is, and like the potential resistance that can come with that on the future of farming?
Yeah, I think it's a massive issue, and you've got so at some time, I'd say 10 years ago, if you'd asked me, I'd have almost assumed that dealing with it as an issue would go hand in hand with massive changes, sort of reductions in indoor intensive farming, because levels of antibiotic use globally and in the UK at that time were quite high. And in a way, the system seemed to be sort of built, like really reliant on high antibiotic use. And so you'd have expected that if you took away the antibiotics, those systems will fall over. And I think what we've seen, particularly in the UK, but also in Netherlands, Denmark and other places where you've seen quite big reductions in antibiotic use in the past 10 years, is actually through kind of biosecurity, so really clean management of those systems. Actually, you can keep really intensive indoor large-scale farms going with much lower levels of antibiotic use than was previously thought possible. So if you're in that kind of industry, that's great news. If you were someone who was thinking that, well, that will be the undoing of a set of systems that are bad for other reasons to do with animal welfare, then you're like, oh, okay, maybe we need to be thinking about something else that is it some doing instead. So it's kind of depending on where you're looking at it. It's kind of mixed news. But overall, antibiotic use has gone down quite a lot in the UK since there's been a concerted effort by government and by the industry to take the issue seriously and kind of move away from some of the ways it was being used before.
I guess just looking at the map you show that we don't need to, the UK is showing land use and how we don't need to have that much intensive land, we will eat less meat. I guess from the point of view of like farmers' income and incentives, obviously if they're kind of much less intensive using the use of the land, they're going to make less money. Like, how do you just see that from government funding? Like, how do you see that being incentivized if that was a kind of solution?
Yeah, so that's where there's been loads of kind of work by government in the past 5 years or so, and lots of other people, and Europe as well, all trying to figure out how do you move from the idea that farmers might be paid for doing more environmental work and to make it worth their while, to the reality of actually designing it such that they get their money on time, they get paid for useful stuff, it doesn't kind of end up kind of backfiring in some horrible, unanticipated way. And it's really difficult. I think it's one thing is that's absolutely clear is farmers need the confidence that the money's going to be there in some shape or other to be able to plan their businesses, and they need that clarity sooner rather than later. And one of the big difficulties has been this government, despite spending loads of time trying to design these schemes, hasn't committed beyond the next election, because it kind of can't, but it could probably make it easier to give farmers some certainty to what money will be there. So if you're a farmer, you're kind of going, well, do I want to change the way I do my business if in a couple of years' time the rug gets pulled out from under the whole way I'd assume things would work. So it's really tricky. A few years ago, the word on the street was that that some people within DEFRA, within the environment and farming ministry, saw things rather differently and thought that actually, if you did pull the rug out from farmers, then you would see quite a lot go out of business, but you'd also see, in effect, a lot of land abandonment and accidental rewilding, and that, from a public money point of view, would be quite a cheap way of getting the benefits. Now, obviously, that would be a real disaster from a kind of rural livelihoods, and if you care about farmers, which most people in the country, they're one of the most popular professions in the country, routinely year after year, then nobody wants that to happen. So it's not a good route to go, and it's not the route government has gone. But that was certainly the idea that was floating around, this sense that you could almost sort of let this stuff happen on the cheap, simply because you make farming economically much less viable. So but that's not the route we're going, I hope, and I hope it's not the route that we accidentally find ourselves in with a new policy direction.
Final question.
Thank you. So just thinking about the sort of amount of meat that we import from overseas and the environmental damage that does, is there a sort of balancing point where we switch on more capacity domestically and sort of cut back on those imports to actually try and stabilise, or is it just the economics and the environmental damage that we're doing here versus overseas that it just doesn't work?
I think it's really messy. I think, and part of the issue with trade is you can have trade deals and so on, but a lot of it's sort of out with anyone's control. In another bit of work I'm involved in, we're commissioning some trade economists to look at that, not just for meat, but just in general. Like, where is there what you call a sort of safe operating space, where you want to be for our balance of trade on different food types, and the answer trade economists tend to give is no. Like, trade just comes out in the wash. It's not something you plan for. It's just something that happens when you do all the other stuff you're trying to do with production efficiency or whatever, and to do with trade deals and so on. And then the trade is the outcome. Your balance of trade is the outcome, precisely because it's so hard to sort of make it behave in certain ways on purpose. But that logic only holds so far. So clearly there is certain, you can sort of imagine us importing loads and loads of everything, and that's that kind of seems not a good idea. Or growing everything ourselves, And that probably seems not a good idea. So you're right, there's sort of a space in the middle, but trying to get some numbers on that and a clear picture from anybody who spends their time thinking about it is really, really hard. Sorry.
All right. Well, the important thing to remember, as consumers, all of you here, 3 times a day, are deciding the future and the type of agriculture that you want. And whether they like it or not, farmers will have to respond and meet the demands of the marketplace that you create. So we'll all wait to see in the future which of the 4 outcomes that Tom's outlined there for animal agriculture you all end up selecting, in effect. And if that's a simplistic way of ending on a very complex debate, hopefully that's a good take-home message as any. But please show your appreciation in the usual way for Tom McMillan from RAU. Thank you very much.
Thanks.